Battles are flashy, and in some famous cases, such as the Battle of Hastings, they can determine the outcome of wars. But those cases tend to be the exception, and to truly win a war or enforce your will on a political opponent through military force, it is often necessary to siege them too. Within Paradox games, this is no exception, and especially as one tends to go on a lot of military campaigns throughout the many Paradox titles, this naturally means that you end up also going on a lot of sieges. Throughout history, both the targets of sieges as well as the besiegers would evolve, going from simple wooden palisades to medieval castles to impressive bunker systems, while the besiegers themselves would increase their arsenal too, starting from large tree log we shoved into the enemy wall, evolving into complex engineering marvels which are putting that whole trigonometry thing we invented yesterday to use. And finally, in the 21st century, the machines of war are so complicated they now offer employment to thousands of engineering graduates annually. With that said, today I want to look through sieges throughout Paradox titles and judging what works and what doesn't. My main criteria today is not a question of historical accuracy, to be clear, but a matter of enjoyment. Now for me, being accurate to the time period and allowing for roleplay within the domain of the game is an important factor in this question, but I do bring this up to clarify that I'm inherently here to judge fun first, and being historically accurate is just a factor within that domain, not the dominating force. That disclaimer said and done, we have just one more thing to get out of the way before we continue. A like on a video would be appreciated, and a subscription will be amazing. I'll be honest, a large big milestone is right around the corner, 50,000 subscribers, and while we certainly remain a couple thousand off, well, I can dream big, so let's go for 50k together. With all that said and done though, let's put the self-shitting aside and go straight into Imperator Rome. The issue with Imperator Rome happening first chronologically is that a lot of Imperator Rome siege mechanics are inherited from EU4, down to the siege dice roll mechanic, and hence I believe are better left to be discussed inside the EU4 section rather than this one, as this is basically a modified EU4 siege. As such, instead I would take this opportunity to discuss what Imperator Rome does differently compared to EU4, and for those that are unaware of how EU4 siege systems operate and want to watch that section first, well, you're more than welcome to skip forward in the video to the EU4 timestamp and then return to this section at your leisure. With that said, let's go through the differences. We are still rolling a dice between 1 and 14 for our siege progress roll, but a weird difference already happens when attempting to siege late game fortifications without siege buffs. See, disease outbreaks are punishing, killing 5% of your besiegers, but while in EU4 you only get a disease outbreak on a natural one, in Imperator a total score of 1 gives you the disease outbreak. In practice, this means that in EU4 if you are sieging something with a total modifier of -2 and you rolled a 3, this nets you a status quo, and in Imperator you get a disease outbreak. In practice, all this means though is that in Imperator, sieging high-level fortifications without bonuses is even more punishing, but considering how most campaigns involve stacking siege bonuses, this rarely happens anyway. Another big difference is the lack of a naval blockade is literally halved, from a -2 to a -1, which honestly makes sense from a thematic point of view. The importance of naval dominance would increase by the EU4 period compared to the Imperator one, but it does mean that coastal forts are less annoying, for a lack of a better word, for primarily land powers that do navy badly, otherwise known as Rome, aka the main character. Finally, on the siege itself, since generals don't have separate fire, shock, maneuver and siege pips like in EU4, their total military competence, for lack of a better word, is reduced to a martial skill, much like within Crusader Kings. This does make the system of general siege pips a strict simplification, as instead of having a dedicated skill for sieging, instead 1/5 of the total martial skill of a general is used, so you gain +1 siege for every 5 martial skill, rounding down. It does help with consistency, namely that bad generals are bad at sieging and good generals are good at sieging, and it does reduce the micro of a somewhat common situation in EU4, where you have a general good at fighting and then another general that is actually awful at fighting but happens to be your best siege general, so you cycle between them depending on what you're doing. I'm not a personal fan of this implication. I would prefer to keep a siege pips and fighting pip category separate, but the 1/5 martial skill system is more than passable. Siege wall breaches remain the same as EU4, and cannons are replaced with engineer cohorts, but a big difference for the sieges is that it is possible to gain siege technology, for lack of a better word, which gives you passive bonuses to sieging, so basically a preemptive +1 roll to all future sieges. It's pretty neat and quite strong, as you can imagine. Otherwise, everything else down to modifiers like siegeability and fort defensiveness, which is renamed to fort defense for some reason, is kept the same from a gameplay point of view. With that all said though, two main differences occur between EU4 sieges and Imperator sieges, and they don't happen directly within the siege. First of all, the occupation of a regional center or fort gives the attacker occupation of the entire province. This is similar to the system in CK3, where sieging down a local castle will give you control of the cities and churches in the area automatically, but if you want to fight over those occupations, well, you're more than welcome to. This is strictly a good thing in my opinion. It, for the most part, if not entirely, eliminates the need for carpet sieging. This system potentially could be modded into EU4. There is a concept called on-action modding, so on declare will have acts happen in types of mods, and I believe it would be possible to mod an on-action where on winning a siege, the attacker will be granted occupation of the provinces not yet occupied by anyone in the same state, which are also not under a fort or have troops sitting on them, and unsieging a fort would do a similar effect. There will be a lot of edge cases, but certainly does seem doable, and to be clear, this is a conceptual statement. statement. I haven't created a mod of this nature myself, but if someone wants to give it a go, they are more than welcome to do so. But EU4 modding potential aside, this is the Imperator section after all. And to be clear, the regional occupation system is a good system and is a very welcome addition to make the game more enjoyable. Another positive addition, ironically enough, compared to EU4 is the troop automations. They do exist in EU4, but the troop automations in Imperator I found to be a lot better at actually doing what I want them to do. The EU4 Carpet Siege AI, when turned on, gets spooked by 3k particular stacks and carpet sieges by putting all 41k stacks on the same province, one at a time. Meanwhile, honestly, the Imperator Auto Siege AI does a fine job. Now, I would do a better job if I microed it myself, for sure, but it's certainly good enough. And for a feature that is best described as turn on when I've already won the war and I want to look back at the area in 6 months and see a finished occupation, well, it certainly works quite well for that purpose, I found. To conclude, I believe that Imperator Rome offered non-trivial improvements to the EU4 siege system. It wasn't anything significantly different. But what was changed was either something of a relatively trivial game impact, such as the impact of naval blockades, or the changes were downright positive quality of life features, like the automatic occupation of provinces. It can be best described as a slightly tweaked but more polished version of EU4 sieging, which means that while it is inherently a clearly very comprehensive system from EU4, this does mean that it also inherits many of the flaws from the EU4 system too in the process. I do think it's still a noticeable step up compared to EU4, ironically enough, but for more of the critiques of the system as a whole, you will have to wait until the EU4 section again, since it's basically EU4 sieges reskinned. And with that, let's move on to a system that doesn't steal EU4's homework, Crusader Kings, namely Crusader Kings 2 and Crusader Kings 3 sieges. Crusader Kings 2 had a somewhat simplistic siege mechanic. Troops show up, they walk onto a castle, and if they have more troops than the garrison, the defender would lose some percent of their morale on a somewhat arbitrary seeming siege tick. In essence, the system was as simple as army walks on, waits, and wins siege. But like every Paradox title, there are at least 15 modifiers in play, of which at least 10 are legally mandated to do actually something, while the remaining 5 are purely cosmetic modifiers. This does, however, mean that trying to siege a random Virgin Island is naturally significantly easier than something like Constantinople, which starts the game with a higher than max level Theodosian walls already built. In practice, again, this means that on a normal siege, give or take every 30 days, the defenders would lose 30% of their morale, meaning you'd methodically win after 4 siege ticks of 30% progress each. But on something like the Theodosian walls, you will instead spend 300 days sieging per tick just to inflict 3% progress, meaning sieging Constantinople can genuinely start to rival the lifetime of certain characters. A big part of it, ironically, is the lack of RNG. There are siege events where you can sometimes gain a little bit of free progress or lose some troops while sieging, but those can quite literally in the game rules be turned off. But frankly, they aren't too impactful either. Small complaints aside, this lack of RNG is ironically quite good for planning your campaigns and wars. You know a siege will be over soon, or that a siege will take a while. There are no random 7% siege wins for you or the AI, as while there is a little bit of RNG to the siege, there is nothing major. And we have to address another elephant in the room, for lack of a better word, assaulting forts. In CK2, while fort levels getting higher does lead to an increase in time to siege, well, as the game gets going, you get access to more and more troops. And this means that while assaulting in the early game, or with small amounts of troops, is practically the equivalent of basically clicking the disband army button, in the late game, or once you sit around 50k troops, I find assaulting just becomes free. Sieges no longer need to happen because you don't have to interact with them. You walk onto a siege, press the assault button, and win the siege. Like once you have an empire wielding hundreds of thousands of men, I do see it from a fun point of view that you personally shouldn't be bothered to wait for sieges to finish, but having a win siege button called assaulting is a bit redundant too, I find. This is again addressed in the CK2 startup options, with turning off assaults for fort above level 6, a setting I would endorse, ironically enough, if it wouldn't be a pure case of hypocrisy, as I'll be honest, I've never played a game with it on that I've enjoyed, since a lot of the time, if you do have a 100k death stack on the gates of Jerusalem, well, the win siege button, otherwise known as the assault button, is just a great quality of life. With that all said, I do find that sieges in Crusader Kings 2 overall are still quite good. Assaults, at least in the early game, are very risky affairs, as they should be. Most sieges are negotiated surrenders, historically, aka we siege you until you realize that help isn't coming and you give up. And overall, RNG is present but frankly trivial, allowing for tactically more specific tactical planning around siege length. Another key element too is that bonuses to siege speed are super rare but do exist. The Architect trait, which is non-trivial to acquire, gives 20% to your siege speed. The Siege Leader trait gives 40%, and that used to be it for the vast majority of the game's history, but in the later updates we do get the Chinese generals that you could request for favor, and one of them is the Way of the Leopard, giving you an insane plus 50% siege. But that is actually it for the entire game when it comes to improving your siege speed. Ironically, I think this lack of many small modifiers but literally 3 pretty impactful ones is a good design decision, as it means that when you get them, they do truly feel special. But with that, we move on to the current Crusader Kings title, namely Crusader Kings 3, and I hope the Crusader Kings 2 preamble was at least useful for giving some context on the game that came before, as it were. Crusader Kings 3 personally, I am really a big fan of their sieges. Firstly, the fort levels available are significantly less set in stone and significantly more dynamic. You gain fort levels from everything you would expect, like fort upgrades, to sources from obscene places such as the stewardship tree of all things. But what has also been increased is the arrival of siege men-at-arms on top of the other retinue options, which can significantly increase siege speed. However, the previously reliable and predictable system from CK2 has been brought here and expanded. Higher level fortifications with larger garrisons need more siege progress to capture, so going from 140 progress for small forts to a couple thousand for late game fortifications, and hence making high levels of siege equipment pretty much mandatory through the realities of 50-year siege, if not. Random siege events happen and are actually pretty impactful, but they only ever speed up progress and never slow it down or lead to a situation where there is no siege progress. So you might get unlucky with rolls, but that just means you didn't finish it ahead of time. Another difference that I think is worth mentioning is that unlike in CK2, where just having a large army is enough to blind assault everything, for CK3 you still need to invest into siege men-at-arms that can give you a walls breach necessary for the assault to happen. So it involves at least a touch of a build around it, even if the build in question is quite trivial, to be honest. Overall though, from a fun point of view, I do like sieges in CK2, and CK3 has really improved them in my opinion. But with that said, well, it's downhill from here, as we now get into EU4 sieges. Now, I do love EU4. It certainly is one of the games of all time, but sieges are infuriating at the best of times and are among the top reasons people accuse the AI of cheating or rigging the game dice rolls. To quickly recap the EU4 system, this siege system in EU4 works as follows. When a siege begins, every 30 days a siege tick occurs and a 14-sided dice is rolled. This dice roll is your score and can be modified by other factors, with absolutely everything from enemy blockades to the amount of cannons you brought to the siege, to just how good your general is at pointing said cannons to the enemy, to everything else in the process. If the dice roll happens to exceed 20, you end the siege, and if it's between 5 and 9, you gain siege progress, ranging from supply shortages giving you a +1 to all future dice rolls, to a water shortage giving you +3. Eventually, the total dice roll plus your siege progress, as well as other modifiers and debuffs, all lead to a siege concluding. Now, the nuances of the system are frankly insane. A siege tick takes 30 days at base, but then can be as low as 3 days if you have a lot of siege ability, or as high as 300 days if not more, since it's uncapped if you are attacking a fortification with a modified stacking level of fort defensiveness. On top of that, naval blockades, general siege pips, cannons in the battle, fort level, total wall breaches, and the level of the enemy garrison, as well as your current desire to alt F4, all contribute significantly to the actual dice roll process. Furthermore, the total bonus from artillery is capped at +5, but there's a whole subgroup of modifiers that increase the maximum cap of artillery possible contributions to siege. What a handful of... What a modifier to describe. Now, I find it cool and fun to find and stack modifiers like that and make builds around siege ability or general siege pips or even defensiveness to counter the enemy, so I have no complaints about the complexity there, but let's start with a couple interesting design decisions. And first of all, we have something alluded to in the Imperator Rome section, natural ones. Rolling a natural one, regardless of any other modifier, will always lead to 0 siege progress, and then give the attacking army a disease outbreak, diminishing their troop counts by 5%. This is frustrating. It can be even more frustrating when that 5% attrition takes you under the cannon amount you need for a +1 bonus, leading to a situation where you go from, say, a -7% siege to a -14% siege, or seemingly lose progress on the siege. Of course, you didn't actually lose progress. Once your men recover, assuming you have the manpower to do so, you will regain your siege status back to -7, but it's still frustrating. Or if you happen to get unlucky and roll 2 or 3 disease outbreaks in a row, it's going to be even more devastating. At the risk of getting math involved, you are expected to get 3 disease outbreaks in a row, 1 in every 2,744 siege ticks, using quick napkin math, which is very unlikely, but since the average siege takes around 10 ticks, the total province count of the world is around 3,500, of which I would handwave a guess around 1/5 of provinces either start with a fort or have an AI build a fort on them eventually, which means that you're going to be doing around 500 sieges for a world conquest run on average, meaning that statistically you'll get a situation of 3 back-to-back-to-back disease outbreaks twice per world conquest. Still very rare, and most runs are far from world conquest and involve much less sieging, but I think it paints a reasonable picture, to be honest. Compared furthermore to the CK3 system, a big factor for frustration too is that it's entirely possible to enter a siege on -49% and spend half a year just rolling badly and making exactly 0 progress. Literally, on a -49% siege, you have an effective 50% chance of making exactly 0 progress on a siege tick. And with each tick taking 30 days, again on average, you can be in a situation where for 6 consecutive dice rolls, or again half a year, you roll less than a 7 and hence make 0 progress. Now, the chance of that happening is around 1.5% with some rounding, so it's not very likely to happen, but just the fact that 1 in 6 67 sieges that you start in EU4 that start the siege on minus 49%, or a no modifier siege on level 2 fort, 1 in 67 of those sieges you're going to have no progress statistically for half a year. That is not indicative of good game design. Within CK3, at least you're gaining siege progress, which means that even if the average time to siege remains the same, it just feels less frustrating than staring at 6 bad dice rolls in a row ruin your entire game plan. Having some background progression, even if it's small, is just a nice form of not being annoyed and feel like I'm wasting time sitting on a siege. And with that, we have to bring up another point: the communication to the player on siege progress and chance of victory. See, when you start a siege, the little number you see is the chance of winning the siege on the next dice roll. And simply put, saying that have a minus 21% chance of winning a siege is not very helpful. Like, mentally, I have to do a lot of head calculations to turn that number into something useful. It has to go something like, okay, minus 21% chance, given that I have 40 days of tick since I put on the defensive edict and I saw the early game, that's like 6 months, give or take, before we hit that dangerous minus 7%, unless they get a walls breach or something, and then I'll have to keep an eye on it. And just like that, we've walked into the next main issue, the 7% siege. See, in CK3, if the game tells me that a siege is going to end in 6 months, I can plan around that. If the AI gets lucky, it can end in 5 months, but basically, it's going to be within 5 to 6 months. That's good. In EU4, when a siege hits 7%, it can end anywhere between the next siege tick in 30 days to 3 more years of the AI or me being unlucky and getting a disease outbreak on a 49% siege 3 times in a row. Which for a grand strategy games, or frankly a strategy game, is way too much uncertainty. This furthermore is not helped by the fact that the counter straight up lies to you, in a very specific but honestly not too uncommon scenario, the famous 99% siege. 99% sieges do not exist within the definition of the game. The highest possible you can get a siege to is 92%. What a 99% siege is saying is that if you roll a number between 1 and 14 on this dice, which can roll any number between 1 and 14, you will win. AKA, since you have plus 19 progress, even if you roll 1, you will hit 20 and win. Excellent argument, but it's a lie. See, on a natural 1, you, by game rules, don't get any progress and suffer a disease outbreak, leading to a plethora of memes of 99% siege Lamau disease outbreak. And ironically enough, it is absolutely possible to walk onto a quote-unquote 99% siege and just roll 3 natural 1s in a row, making it look like you lost 3 99% chances in a row. At which point, yeah, I will agree with people on the internet, that does seem super rigged. It's not, the 99% thing is a lie, but the 99% siege lie is a terrible communication method, which is a massive shame. It's a very well designed from a modifier and content point of view, with a lot of fun stuff going on, like genuinely dynamic assaults, and I would love to see it more if it did involve so much frequent frustration. And with that said, we move on to Victoria 3. Okay, well, I have in front of me over a 1 hour, for lack of a better word, let's see, incomprehensible screechings of a deranged madman, which begin with a comprehensive criticism of the entire Victoria 3 combat system, but then proceeds to a section about how Victoria 3 is a multinational conspiracy by the Ottomans to destroy the Paradox Interactive Company using bad game design, and finally concludes by calling for the establishment of a new holy order that conducts weekly rituals to purify the Victoria 3 military code to ensure that no mortal is ever subjected to it, and also calls for the complete rework of the Victoria 3 military system to abolish this fragment of primordial evil so that God may send his son down from heaven, as clearly this military system is preventing the second coming of Christ. Yeah, I can't publish this in a video. Like, poor Victoria 2 combat and siege mechanics aside, you're getting ignored due to the crimes of your successor. Anyway, let's take this opportunity to move on to a nice and innocent topic. Hearts of Iron 4. By the time we enter Hearts of Iron 4, we enter this little military innovation called maneuver warfare. The defending from people with big cannons was something that the Europeans started doing before the cannons actually arrived in Europe. So we have a long military tradition of building big defensive fortifications. With that tradition though came the slight realization that massive big fortifications were kind of expensive actually. However, by the time we hit World War I, we enter the post-industrial, we have more money to spend on war kind of budget. Hence World War I starts to see the absolutely genius innovation of, if enemies can't break through the fort, and having a fort gives us a big advantage in the fight, why don't we just put the forts everywhere? Again, genius idea, but there's a problem. It worked, and we now have static trench warfare. This makes it somewhat hard to discuss a siege when every battle is now a siege. But Hearts of Iron 4 is a World War II simulator, not World War I, and with the World War II we get this innovation on top of our previous innovations called maneuver warfare, which technically existed before, but it's back and is taking central stage now. As such, sieges conceptually are pretty rare, as they tend to be instead reduced down to local province modifiers, such as defensive holding a fortified position or fort, instead of attackers encircling enemy positions to starve them out. This makes it a bit hard to discuss them since they were much rarer in history either, meaning their presence in the game is hindered, but they did happen. And one of the rather infamous sieges in World War II was the Siege of Leningrad. The siege lasted 3 years before 1941 and 1944, and to say it was an insanely devastating siege is a massive understatement. But it was in practice an example of very conventional siege. A large defensive force, and the attackers attempting to starve them out, as a direct assault on the city would be considered too costly. As a player, you can choose to attempt such assaults, and if successful, you can capture the city, but otherwise in Hearts of Iron 4, encircling it doesn't do as much, as it's basically a multi-province city, meaning that doing it historically would leave you with 4 provinces, and hence no encirclement penalty. And the city itself provides magical local supply, which resupplies the defenders. As such, Hoi 4 sieges are frankly a bit pointless, which is fair. The game is better off without them from a fun point of view. So although I would argue that siege mechanics are very bad in Hoi 4 as they don't exist from a practical point of view, that's honestly still fine. The game doesn't need sieges to work. And for things like the Siege of Leningrad to work, local supply would need another rework, because Leningrad may be more than capable of supplying the defenders with weapons from its factories, but it certainly was less than able to use those same factories to manufacture food. But with that all said, while Hoi 4 can get away with no sieges and still do a good enough job as a military simulator without them, a game which I believe does have a massive disservice to sieges and hence its combat system is of course
nauseating, abominable, contemptible, loathsome, revolting, despicable, heinous, wretched, vile, foul.
Stellaris. Stellaris doesn't have sieges, which is a massive shame. Stellaris combat for the most part involves ships fighting other ships, and while defensive stations do exist, they're basically another stationary fleet which can be captured by the enemy. It can sometimes provide you a defensive bonus of like plus 5% fire rate, but it's generally negligible. Meanwhile, planets can exercise zone of control as well as those defensive stations. Namely, you can't keep going through the system until the planet is captured. But when an enemy fleet enters the orbit of a planet, the planet itself becomes practically defenseless. It is just a matter of time until the enemy fleet bombs out the defensive forces and lands their own troops to take it over. Of course, there is a touch of nuance to this. Bombing out the enemy can take time, giving you the opportunity to recover your ships and come back for round 2 and fight a damaged enemy from your first encounter. But I find in practice, if the enemy is damaged enough from the first fight, they're just going to retreat to the first siege, repair, and then come back to bomb you out. Ironically though, a suggestion for this to make planetary sieges more engaging is planetary defenses. Here I'm going to be borrowing very heavily, inspiration-wise, from Master of Orion 2, a 4X strategy game from 1992, ironically enough, a game older than me and yet contains quite a few interesting concepts I would love to explore. For one, when planets in Stellaris are bombed, it practically involves the same weapons from the ships, namely anti-ship missiles, lasers, and strike craft being deployed to shoot the planet. And bombs, so weapons specifically made to bomb planets, but which are irrelevant for ship-to-ship engagements, don't exist. So let's start with the rebalance of the military tab again to introduce a specific bomb weapon class, which is again very good at dealing planet damage and nerf the damage that conventional weapons deal so that you're more incentivized to make specific planet bombing ships. Next, we're going to shove defensive weapons onto the planet. So we already have these things called ICBMs here on Earth today, which can shoot a missile from the ground into the orbit, and then from orbit back onto the planet. And while indeed it is very hard to aim in space, it is rocket science, it's certainly doable, and countries today as well have anti-satellite weaponry. So I believe it would be too immersion breaking to introduce this kind of weaponry to Stellaris. And from Master of Orion 2, we actually have 3 types of planetary defenses. Missile launchers, as previously mentioned, that launch missiles against orbiting ships. Powerful lasers, which are basically beam weapons from the ground, but they should be quite a bit weaker since the atmosphere is there and is annoying. And finally, strike craft. Basically build a runway on the planet for space strike craft that take off, go into space or low orbit and shoot at the enemy. Design-wise, think heavily modified F-15 that can enter space and engage for a bit before having to come back down to refuel. From a gameplay point of view, it makes orbital bombardments costly for the attacker as the planets are able to shoot back, and potentially if they're allowed to have system-wide range, the planets could also help in any naval engagement in the local system, giving defenders a practical terrain bonus as it were, almost like ramparts in EU4 giving negative dice roll to the attacker. It would also make prolonged naval sieges of planets more impactful, as the besiegers would be basically forced to incur casualties and attrition from the planet shooting back. Masters of Orion 2 actually has a lot of cool ideas that would work quite well in Stellaris, I believe. For example, in that game, there are some star systems, I would say anywhere between 10 to 30% of the total star systems inside a galaxy, that generate inside a nebula. And inside nebulas, shields don't work. This would add another dynamic terrain modifier, for lack of a better word, to space. And this is somewhat present with the Storm mid-game crisis in Stellaris, but having it as a permanent terrain feature, so a defensive planet in a nebula, where the defensive weapons are optimized to fight against specifically unshielded ships, would be really cool, and genuinely expand what I believe to be a very neglected part of Stellaris, the space and land combat. But to conclude the Stellaris section, Stellaris sieges aren't fun because they don't exist, and I hope that my proposed solution at least interesting enough for people to consider. Overall though, to recap, Imperator Rome uses a modified EU4 system, which is a touch better, but overall nothing too major compared to EU4, and I believe it is a good improvement due to the auto-occupations and hence removal of the need to carpet siege, as well as the better automation AI. Crusader Kings 2 had a decent system that by CK3 became my gold standard for pre-industrial sieges, offering an engaging system with random chance, but one that can be planned and intentionally reasonably manipulated by the player. Victoria 3, there'll be no further comment on Victoria 3 combat, but to move on to Hoi 4, well, Hoi 4 needs to remove or drastically rework local supply to make sieges a thing. And finally, Stellaris needs a planetary and system defense overhaul to add sieges for this discussion to even occur, which I think will be personally very cool. But that is all I have time for today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Solemon, W Haste, Sebastian Haller, Churndog 2.0, Nick Haas, Dark Fortuna, Big Salad, Leb Josh, Gay Fug, Clockwork Norse, Golden Arrows, Nan Hatan, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Pro Gaming, Grand Admiral Flavia, Kono, and Andreas Alberg.